I spent a day in this forest doing macro photography, and this is everything I found. At the beginning of my walk, I came across this large mossy fallen tree, and after looking at it for a bit noticed a few mushrooms on it. I decided to photograph these two here as they stood out and were quite unique. I then walked along this small stream looking at some of the rotting wood, and I noticed this small cluster of mushrooms on this large piece of wood here. They're a little bit difficult to photograph due to the location being so close to the water. I couldn't quite get the camera far enough away, but I still got a photo that I was pleased with. Walking along the footpath, I stumbled across this small toad. It appeared to be a bit injured and was a bit of a sad sight really, but it didn't seem too disturbed by it. So I proceeded to photograph it a couple of times, getting the camera nice and low here. As you can see, it was quite unfazed by me being around it. And of course, after taking these photos, I did also very gently encourage it to move off the footpath before the place got busy, as this was early morning still at the time. Finishing my short walk in this first location, I came across this quite young shaggy mane mushroom. Ideally I would have liked to have found it a little bit later in its growth stage, but I was still pleased with this. I then moved on to a more wooded, typical forest area, as I thought there'd be more species to find here. And right away I found this quite bizarre looking mushroom growing out of this stick. I gently balanced this stick on top of a few other pieces of wood to get it elevated enough to photograph, and using my small tripod got the camera in place. It was a little bit fiddly, but I got there in the end. And while taking that photo I noticed some small white specks on a leaf next to me, which were these tiny Typhula species. So I very gently placed this on one of the pieces of wood that I was using to balance the earlier stick. Managed to get the camera in a way that I could photograph it quite close up. I then came across this piece of wood with hundreds of tiny mushrooms growing out of it, and there was two different species here, which made it even more interesting. I struggled to know which ones to photograph, so I isolated a few that I felt were best, starting with this larger white one here that I thought was really nice with the small water droplet on the side of the cap. I then moved to this really tiny juvenile one next to that first one, as I thought this was interesting to show the different growth stage. After that, I photographed this larger one here, as I believe it's a different species and has a bit more colour to it, so I thought it'd be interesting to show the difference. Before finally moving on to this small white one, same as the first two, as again this was a perfect shape and I liked the translucent stem of it. I then decided to move on from that piece of wood before I got too distracted and spent an hour photographing the same tiny mushrooms. And shortly after, I came across this cluster of mushrooms growing out of the end of this piece of wood. I had to move the camera quite far back to photograph these as they were quite large with the 90mm lens attached. I then found yet another small white mushroom, this one being a little bit different, and again photographed it the same way as before. One thing I always try to do when photographing small ones like this is make sure that there is nothing close to the background, and that if I can, make sure the background is dark as well to really show the contrast in colour. I also came across this moss with quite a few sporophytes on it. I decided to photograph these as it's an interesting subject that's a little bit different to my usual. And I really liked this as well because one of them had a perfect droplet of water on the end of it. Moving back to mushrooms, I found this real picture perfect mushroom growing in this grass and sticks here. and because of where it was, it also had this really nice backdrop to it of all the blurred, out of focus sticks and grass. And when looking through the camera, noticed that there was a small moth on the underside too, so I took a close-up photo of that as well. I then moved into a slightly more dense area so that I could search through some leaf litter and sticks to try and find some more tiny mushrooms, ideally of different species. And it wasn't long before I found this tiny marasmius growing out of the end of this small leaf. These can be quite common in places, but they're always tricky to photograph. With the really delicate stems, even the smallest amount of air movement can make it difficult. And so I very gently balanced it on some of this old bracken leaves in a place where there was no wind, and managed to get this really nice photo using the dark background technique again. I later came across this old piece of wood with two different species of mushrooms growing out of it. I first decided to photograph the more orange coloured ones to the right, using the same technique as always, getting as low as I could with my flexible tripod, trying to get underneath to capture that gill detail on them. I then moved to the smaller white mushrooms to the side, and these turned out to be one of my favourite photos from the entire walk. They were just so perfectly framed, with nothing too close in the background to clutter the scene either. And following that, I decided to walk ahead a bit more and try and find a new location to search through. And while on that walk, noticed this small white mycena mushroom growing out of the leaf litter. I usually see a lot of these, but this one stood out as one that would be quite easy to photograph. Eventually, at the final location, I came across these bright yellow wax caps. I've never found this species before, so I was quite excited to photograph them. I first photographed this larger one here. Unfortunately, because of the thick grass and moss, I couldn't get the angle I wanted, but it still turned out nice. I then moved on to photograph the other one over here, as I thought it stood out a little bit more and might prove to be easier to photograph. While taking those photos, I'd noticed these tiny white mushrooms on this stem here, and these turned out to be one of my favourite photos from the whole day. They were so unique. It was difficult to photograph, as you see here. I had to balance it within the grass. And also in the same location, I noticed these tiny pin mushrooms on this small piece of bark. Before my final find of the day was this quite large white mushroom in here. Didn't turn out to be the best photo, but it's a species I don't really find, so I was quite keen to photograph it anyway. And with that, my day here was done. So if you've enjoyed this video and you'd like to see more, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe.